All right, well, welcome everyone to another session in the product track. Thank you all for coming. We've been having a good week, and day 4, one more day to go. We are competing against Happy Hour, so when we finish, we'll tell you where that's at. So real quick, just going to thank sponsors and things like that. For those of you actually in the back, just to let you know, we have weird acoustics in this venue, and we kind of have two mics duct taped together. So sometimes on panels it can get a little hard. So you're more than welcome to come up if it gets hard to hear. With that said, Denver Startup Week is the largest conference like this in the world that is free. So it's the largest free startup conference around, and it's super great to be back in person. So thank you all for coming. Last 2 years were all remote and a little weird, so gaining momentum again. Hybrid, yes, there were a few in person. This year we had a few virtual sessions, and I think they've gone horribly wrong, so we're 100% in person. But anyway, with that said, it's totally put on by volunteers. All these speakers up here and panelists submitted ideas, came up with what would be cool for the community. The community voted on it, and here we are. So thank you to all of you, and thank you to all of you for showing up. It's what makes it happen. With all that said, wanted to thank Amazon, Capital One, Dell, and the Downtown Denver Partnership. They're our main sponsors, but we have a long list of folks that make this happen so we can afford the venues and pull off the event. A lot of this is recorded as well, so it'll be available to anyone within a few days if you want to share it. And the last sponsor I want to thank is Pi Insurance. They're the specific sponsor of the product track, so give them a little extra love if you're in the need for insurance. But with that, I'm going to pass it off to Courtney, and we'll get going.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me well enough in the back? Good? All right, cool. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us right before happy hour. Appreciate it. My name's Courtney Chanot. I work at Sneak, and I'll be moderating this panel today about the benefits of thinking about privacy compliance, data privacy as part of your strategy as a startup founder or a person that works at a startup. So super excited for this. We got 4 total badasses here today to talk with us. So I'll let everybody introduce themselves, maybe starting with Susan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Susan Hubbard. I am a director of legal at Ping Identity. Ping Identity is a cybersecurity company focusing on enterprise software and SaaS.
Awesome. Oh, can you guys hear me okay? Remy Lyle. I'm the senior director of pre-sales engineering at Ping, which is right across the street. So Susan and I work together. So excited to be here.
I'm John Rosendahl. I am the director of product for Sovereign's Ad Exchange. We are a company that helps publishers monetize their content and be able to, have growing businesses.
And I'm Melissa Cooper. I run privacy and compliance for Sovereign as well. And I'm super happy to see you all. Please move up if you would like. And with that.
Great. Susan is a lawyer, and so I would like to state firmly and for the record that the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not reflect the positions or views of the companies that they work at. So check that one off the list. So I actually did not know how many countries there are in the world specifically until I was talking with you guys about this panel, and I learned there are 196 countries in the world. And if anybody wants to guess what percentage of them are engaged in privacy laws in some form or another out of 196 countries in the world. 62%. 120 out of 196 countries globally are engaged in privacy laws in some way or another. So guessing that you all work with startups in some form or another, but that is a lot of countries, and that's a lot of things for you to be thinking about, especially if you're trying to figure out how to scale your business. And for depending on where we are in the maturity of our companies, there's probably a lot of different factors going into the way that you're thinking about this, but at the end of the day, whether you're a consumer or you are the customer of other B2B businesses, your customers care about privacy and care about what you're doing with their data. They may not be articulating that to you yet, but it's really important, and it's good that you're here today to think about your strategy. So we have 4 questions that we'll talk through today, and definitely want to hear from everybody on them. But if anybody has like a follow-on question that is fairly brief, please feel free to raise your hand and just ask it. Would love to make this interactive so that it's not just us talking. So maybe starting with the first one is around how should I be thinking about data and privacy regulations in general as a startup. So Melissa, since you are holding the microphone, you want to share?
Absolutely, thank you. So the first thing you need to really consider when you think about just the sheer number of regulations, and especially if you don't have any sort of geo restriction in your particular line of work. So if you have a product or service, for example, that can accept personal information from anywhere around the world, you need to understand the differences in what it means to be processing personal information. So if you think about the regulations specifically, and I don't know how familiar you all are, but the definition of personal data or personal information is so broad. It can range from a very benign indirect identifier like a cookie or an IP address, all the way to personally identifiable information such as first name, last name, a postal address, a phone number, that sort of thing, to sensitive personal information or special categories of personal information, depending on the regulation that you're considering. And that can be things like biometric data, right? Are you using facial recognition in your product? Political affiliations, depending on, like in my world, if we're talking about audience segmentation, we've got an election year coming up, or election season coming up, I should say. So really just understanding the kinds of data that you're processing along with the sources of that data. Maybe really the most sensitive personal information that you're processing comes directly from your staff, right? So if you have low risk personal information through your products and services in the form of indirect identifiers, your staff data is really where you're going to want to focus your risk assessment efforts and think about the way you're managing your staff personal information.
Thanks, Melissa.
Yeah, so that was awesome. And from a product standpoint, right, we want to think about our customers. And you do not want to have your decisions be the reason that either your company or, even worse, your customer's company is in the newspapers. I really think there's a location data company that just got in a ton of trouble for having overly specific location data. This was totally a fine practice 6 months ago, and it's probably the end of the company this year. So it's something that you really have to keep track of and something that you have to understand. When we talk to our customers and we're bringing new services to market, the first thing we ask, especially when we're dealing with European customers, is this privacy compliant? How are you able to ensure that the data that you have is consented, is being used appropriately? And how can you document the controls that you have in place in order for us to feel comfortable with that product? And as a smaller company, selling to larger companies, they've got the large compliance team that's going to go through and make sure that you are okay with them. And so you have to be in front of that in order to be able to make the sale.
And actually, can we pause for 1 second? Since both of you work for Sovereign, and Sovereign is obviously in the like programmatic and affiliate marketing. Yeah, I was going to say, can you share what Sovereign does and why this matters?
Yeah. So Sovereign helps publishers monetize their content. We do that through advertising. We have an ad exchange. We do that through affiliate marketing. We also do that through ad management products where we help them, we'll take publisher content and take on their entire monetization stack. We also have a relatively large data sales organization where we utilize some of the exhaust from our activities in order to help people define audiences and understand their customers better.
Within that context, does anybody have a question that they'd want to ask these two before we go on to the Ping Identity folks? No? Okay. Oh.
So knowing that you're in like the web data sphere, so how do you ensure that data that you're collecting is actually like given or under the consent of users who are like sending you that data, right? So like I'm on a website, I click, like yes, I want to be tracked, or I don't want to be tracked. So how do you make sure that you're follows that consent?
That's a great question. I'm just going to repeat it for everyone in the room. Essentially, the question was, how do we understand that the individual on the other end has actually consented for their data to be used and processed? So there's a couple of things packed into there. It depends on who the user is, right? And we do deal only in indirect identifiers. So we're not going to fly in the face of data privacy regulation and collect more data than we need to in order to understand the individual. So we literally have an IP address. And I'm sure anyone here, because this is the product track, understands the challenge in that in today's day and age where VPNs are oftentimes just embedded in operating systems, and many folks are getting more and more comfortable using those VPNs. And so yes, a VPN shields where you're coming from, but it also makes it really hard for us to know exactly what data rights to apply. But specific to consent, I mean, and we only can operate off of what we have, right? So that's kind of the first cutter. But specific to consent, we have the ability to technically recognize the signals that are being sent through basically the digital advertising supply chain. So there's a couple of ways we do that. And I always love, I'm glad you asked this question. I love plugging this. We were just talking about this on the way over, that essentially there's a industry regulatory organizations, self-regulatory organizations such as the Digital Advertising Alliance that have offered consumer controls before even GDPR was a thing. So that combined with browser controls, right? These are all technical signals that are being broadcast through your browser, and folks like John make sure our engineers can recognize those signals. Is that
Awesome. And before we dive into you answering that question, I will re-ask the question, but do you mind sharing what Ping does and why Ping cares about privacy?
I'll take this. Is it on? Oh, yes. I'll answer this question this way. I'm so sorry. I promise I know how to use a microphone. So Ping Identity, we are headquartered here in Denver, as I mentioned. I guess at the heart of it is we connect identities to applications. And so when, we talk about like data privacy, it's, we definitely deal with like user data, right? And how do we handle that? And how does our software handle that? Or our services like handle that data? So yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything else, Susan, but. Okay, perfect.
And then the question, just to repeat the question,
yes,
since it's been a minute, the question was just generally, how should I be thinking about data and privacy risk in general?
Yeah, so I think I'd actually like to touch on a few points that John made. So I think what's interesting, I think from my position, is that I come from a background of both being technical, being an engineer, but also being in sales. So we're actually in many ways the interface of the customer to our product teams. And one thing that I'll just point out is, I think you have to really, just like security, right? Data privacy is one of those things that just has to be part of the DNA of the application or the product that you're building. Because if you don't, right, as John alluded to, what are the risks that you're opening up for your customers, like not having that as a fundamental part of your architecture? But also you have to think about, the risk or the cost that it could potentially cost you if you have to re-architect your system or your platform or your software to account for data privacy controls that you may not have thought about like in the beginning, right? So what is the cost of, so I'm all about like numbers. So like, what is more expensive, right, in the long run? And I think from a sales perspective, it really is important that when you go talk to your customers that, you can go to sleep peacefully at night knowing that you have done everything that you can to protect the information that you have. So, otherwise, like, I don't know, I feel like it's hard to sell something that you know that you only did like halfway. So that's my perspective on it.
Thanks for me. I think what I would add to that is a lot of companies' kind of motivation behind their risk approach to data privacy and data compliance is the, avoidance of regulatory fines because they can be so big and so scary. And I think while that's obviously very important, I think a better, more commercial way to think about it is building a privacy risk strategy that's based on transparency and accountability. Because while that helps you mitigate the risk of fines, it also really builds trust and loyalty with your customers and gives you an advantage in the market. I think that's really important with startups because so much of your business is built on user trust, and that's how you're going to grow. So I think if you're looking at privacy through, the building your risk strategy, building your program through the view of privacy, risk, and transparency, then you're able to be open about how you're using data, and you're able to use personal data to improve your products and build your products. But the key is you're being open about that with your customers, and your customers are aware of how you're using their data, and so they're going to be more likely to support that.
Yeah, love all of that. And I think I'm actually kind of curious for the audience, if you don't mind just like raising your finger, how many, if you work at a company that has less than 100 employees, do 0, 1 for 100, 200, 300, like how big of companies are we talking about here?
We're about 100.
Okay. All right, so it looks like there's a lot of variance. I'm seeing zeros and several 5s being flashed and 8s. Okay, cool. So there's a large variety of business sizes represented here, and I think, going into the next question I have for you guys, there's so many complexities and gray areas in this space, and I'm sure that especially for startup founders and companies under 100 employees, every dollar counts, and navigating this space can be really challenging. So my next question, maybe starting with you, Susan, again, would be how can small businesses comply with a patchwork of regulations?
I think the cost of complying with all of these different privacy laws is a lot more burdensome on startups than large companies, just simply because you don't have the resources that large companies have. I think the reality, though, is that your legal obligations are the same. So it puts you in not the best position. But the good news, relatively speaking, is that regulators also have limited resources. And so the past few years, at least, they've seemed to be, although not exclusively, they seem to be focused on making examples out of large companies. I think that being said, your customers still expect you to have appropriate privacy compliance in place. And so things that you should be thinking about and how you build that privacy compliance baseline, I think there's 3 things. One is I think you need to fulfill all of the privacy obligations and promises that you make to your customers. So do what you say you're going to do in your online privacy statements and in your contracts. I think 2, I think that you should be having reasonable security controls in place to protect personal data against a breach. What reasonable means is really contextual based on the type of data that's involved, the industry that you're in, the geographies in which you operate. And then I think 3 is establishing a culture of accountability at your company. So that means training your employees to be aware of privacy and to understand their obligations so they can exercise good judgment when using personal data. I think it also extends to your third parties that you work with, your contractors and your vendors, and making sure that they protect personal data to the same extent that you do.
Yeah, and I think what I'll just add to what Susan said is, first of all, I think you have to be honest with what your strengths are and like where your weaknesses are and like what you feel comfortable with and, what regulations, you really know about or, because we actually have this conversation all the time of like, what is the cost of trying to do everything ourselves versus possibly outsourcing to a team of experts that can help us do it right the first time. That's honestly kind of like my theme of life is like, why don't we just do things right the first time? And we have this conversation all the time, like with our own customers, right? Even in the, during the sales process. So I think you just have to, really think about, what is going to be, best for us like long term as far as managing all these different regulations and what are we good at and what can we outsource. And of course, the other thing is what technologies can help with this and how can we outsource this so that there's possibly less manual work. So the tech might cost you a little bit more money to try and automate some of these processes, but it could be worth it if that means, you're not having to do it all yourselves. So.
Super helpful. I want to pause again just halfway through here in case anybody in the audience has a specific question that they want to ask the panel, and then we can go to the other 2.
Can I go on there? I'm curious. Colorado's been a leader in blockchain. I know a study I did for the Colorado Department of Ag, we talked about each person owning their individual data and reselling of the data.
Yeah.
Where do you think this is going to go? Because, I mean, is
So I love this question because I actually think our company is a leader in this space. Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was getting into blockchain, where are we headed with like decentralized identity is sort of, I think, where each person is responsible for bringing their own like data and their own identity, right? Yeah. So so Ping, I think, at least our company, has put a lot of thought, and one of the things we're actually known for is participating in like standards bodies and helping set some of those standards. So I can tell you that one of the things right now, I think we're getting to that, and our CEO talks about this all the time, but we're getting to that influx point where the whole notion of identity architectures have become so complex to the point where the consent question from earlier, right? Like we're having to have all these like different architectures like manage consent and like how we deal with that data. But you really do turn the industry upside down, thinking about it where it's decentralized identity, and people show up and people can decide when and what parts of their data that they'd like to share at what times, right? So, I mean, I know for us that's where we're headed, and I know that there's a lot of standards work that's happening in that space, and you know our company is a big participant of that. But it does turn the notion of like having to register, having to authenticate, having to give your consent. It really changes the you know sort of how you would approach privacy, because it's privacy, like you give consent as part of doing the transaction because you release the data when you want to. So.
Can I follow up with another question?
Sure.
How's that going to affect commercial data too, which has some of?
Oh, Melissa wants to answer.
Yeah, because there's commercial and there's transactional data that'll be similar and.
Absolutely. And the question was, how does that impact commercial data, right? So there's the transaction that you do as an individual as you navigate the World Wide Web. And then there's the commercial side of data, like the mantra of data's the new oil, right? And actually, I'm going to pause there. I have a perspective on the prior concept, which was the question around, you know, does that make what we're talking about today go away? And the answer is no. Just because you've authenticated, just because you've chosen to release your personal information to an entity for whatever reason, that doesn't negate the need to protect the privacy of that individual. So I don't think that it goes away, but I think it does change the industry. And I'm going to put you on the spot, John. I can speak to it a little bit, but some of the blockchain technology that's used in the bid stream from an accountability perspective, do you feel comfortable talking about that? Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, no,
I can give a high overview. So in our industry, what I've been keeping an eye on is there is this sense of, as it relates to, I'm going to call it commercial data. It's the data that's necessary to support the digital advertising supply chain being passed from entity to entity via blockchain technology. And the purpose of this is to not only to ensure the integrity of the partners in the supply chain, but also back to that consent question, right? If a publisher in our network can get consent from an individual and pass that consent via blockchain technology through all the other players, like our ad exchange is a supply side platform. We engage with demand side platforms or DSPs. They in turn engage with agencies, networks, brands, advertisers, so on and so forth. Through all of that transaction, money is changing hands, data is changing hands, and you know, I care, running privacy and compliance for Sovereign, what my demand partners are doing with the data that they can see, because there are zero technical controls over that data. Using blockchain technology to transact that bid stream process, right, just kind of solidifies it. And that's why I said I can speak to it at a super high level. I'm not technical enough to go into like the nuts and bolts of how blockchain actually interacts in the process. So forgive me on that. But we are talking about it in the digital advertising space as well.
Awesome. Thanks for that question. I think we got to keep it rolling, but if anybody has a question about this, feel free to save it for the end, and we'll make sure to save some time for that. But great answers and context. So I just want to repeat the question again. So the question was, how can small businesses comply with a patchwork of regulations? And John, I think it was potentially you that was also talking about like competing priorities between like BI teams and compliance, that sort of thing. So if you don't mind adding a bent to that, that'd be cool.
So this discussion we just had is super important from a product standpoint, because no matter how complicated the laws are, and there's 120 jurisdictions that you have to worry about, many of which are in the United States, it seems at this point in time. There's a lot of details. There's a lot of nuance that I depend on people like Melissa to give me. There's only a couple things you can do. You can the data is either personal or not personal. That's certainly a spectrum, but you can kind of identify like how much of a person can I identify with this particular piece of data. And the other question can you ask you is, do I really need it? Is there a solid business reason for me to have this? And you can turn that into a pretty simple matrix, like a 2x2 matrix of, there's data that is super personal and super valuable, and maybe you do need to keep that. There's data that's super personal and not valuable, and certainly throw that away. And then there's data that's, useful but not personal, and that's definitely a good thing to keep. And so a lot of your compliance posture can just come from understanding the data that is collected, understanding what your actual business needs are, pushing back on those people that are, the business intelligence folks that are saying, well, if I had this more data, I could make better reports that gave us more information. More's not always better, especially with data. The other thing that you can really do is ask yourself, even if I need this data for a business reason, do I actually need this data? A great example is credit cards. I'm sure that almost none of the companies here actually process their own credit cards, and that's because it's terrifying from a compliance standpoint. Just saying credit card makes her worry. So it's terrifying from a compliance standpoint to collect that data. So are there other ways that you can offload some of that compliance effort by storing that data with people that specialize in storing that particular piece of data, ensuring that compliance exists? Alternatively, is there an opportunity for you to build a business doing the same thing?
Yeah, I'm going to answer the question slightly differently, just understanding there's a ton of very, very small organizations in the room today because, you're talking to a panel of folks that has, even if they're very resource-strapped teams, like I'm an army of one at the moment, not for long, but at the moment, right? But I do have legal counsel in-house that I can lean on. I've got folks like John here I can lean on from a technical perspective. So I would just highly recommend, in addition to understanding the data types like I already talked about, understand where that data is coming from. And I don't mean just, from a customer perspective versus staff versus individuals specifically, but the jurisdictions from which they come from. Understand that, and then you can understand what your requirements are. And as it translates into turning that into functional operations that can help you support your business and help you to be compliant, get creative with the folks who are actually overseeing that compliance. It doesn't have to be a person like me. It can be a product manager that you send to go get some privacy light training, so at least that person is thinking about things like John just articulated. You've got tons of external counsel folks if you can't afford to hire your own internal counsel that can help you. And there's a ton of examples publicly available. Who's your competitor? What does their privacy policy say? Right? A lot of regulations specify that you have to have instructions for how you're fulfilling data rights requests. Use that as a launch point for developing your own process. Colorado is about to come into effect, right? Mid-year 2023. everyone in here, if you're processing personal information in Colorado, are going to have a mechanism for satisfying data rights requests. So just as far as how do you stay compliant to a patchwork of regulations, really just paying attention to the highest numbers of sources of that personal information. Use that as your requirements baseline.
The easiest way to comply with a data rights request with a data request is to not have the data. Just keep that in mind.
No data anywhere, ideally.
Or just not for very long. Have it for an hour. Have it for 3 hours. Do you need it for 350 days?
That's a great point. So John, since you're holding the mic, maybe we can mix it up and get kind of crazy here. Everyone in this room, I'm sure, is involved with either determining the roadmap of the company they work for, or helping to execute it, or helping to advance, prioritize it. How best can folks balance a roadmap of new features and products with the privacy controls that they're being required to think about?
I think largely it's not a balance and a design time decision. When you are actually incepting your project, when you're going through your story mapping, when you're actually building your actual roadmap, you have to determine, just like you have to determine what the technical features are, you have to determine what your business features are. You also have to determine what your compliance features are. That probably has to be wrapped up into an overall compliance and risk strategy that you have, where you understand, where are we willing to take on risk, where are we willing to really go all out on compliance. But it really needs to be a part of the design and inception of your project.
We're really switching it up. I would say, my perspective on this question is that, and probably something that is not going to be popular with sales leadership, but I actually think this is the right way to go. And that is, if you are in the middle of having to fix or correct potentially your, how you've approached privacy or your data privacy control, don't be afraid to do a feature freeze. I feel like so many companies are so afraid to do a feature freeze in kind of the hopes that, if I don't have this new feature, or if we don't get it in this quarter, then I'm going to potentially lose out on this sale or lose out on this customer. But I think what we all have to remember is that confidence in your core platform is going to be way more important than any new feature that you're going to build in your product set. So make sure that if you do have to take corrective action to adjust for, better privacy controls in the product or platform or service that you're building, that don't be afraid to do the feature freeze, and don't be afraid to lose the sale to set things back in motion. So I don't know. We're going this way.
Okay, sounds good. I think that decisions regarding the roadmap are obviously really important and not really very easy. So they shouldn't be made in a vacuum, and they should be made taking into account the perspectives of many different stakeholders in your company. So you might not have official legal functions or compliance functions, but maybe somebody from product and security, or somebody who has that skill set, and so that you're really having a holistic conversation about your privacy compliance and what is your company's required compliance features versus those that are preferred. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that having a lot of data is a risk, yes, but there's also a lot of value in that data, and we don't want to forget about that. And we want to enable our companies to use the data. And so you don't want to be overly compliant, and because that's also a risk, right? And you don't want to be overly burdensome on your teams, because that's going to prevent you from reaching your roadmap. So I think that we want to help promote innovation, and we want to help promote using data to create products. And if you make it too difficult, then privacy is going to become an afterthought, which is not the goal, right? We want to be enabling product innovation by being open and transparent about our uses of the data. And I think that's really the key.
Have a John, right? John is actually so great about actually advocating for engineering work that I need worked into the roadmap. But I think really the heart of that is partnership, right? If you have the luxury of having a product manager over your product teams, combined with someone like me that's running privacy operations, then the sweet spot there is, you know, I understand how his road mapping process works. I understand the kind of lead time he needs, and I understand the technology well enough to be able to translate new regulatory requirements into those non-functional requirements that he can then work into what that looks like from a road mapping perspective. I'm not afraid to wait a minute, right? Just because a regulation has changed, it's balancing that risk of enforcement with compliance. So if you have a plan to comply and you need just a minute to get that worked into the roadmap and actually into the engineer's work stream, then take on a little bit of that risk. So I don't quite understand the question. When you say putting the data in the beginning versus the platform side.
Facebook, for example, I guess, like the email and information they get up front about you, right? But if you type, hey, you're just using the platform, right?
Right.
And they're saying something, as a company, is that data any different than the data you're asking for and taking? Or is it all the data on your platform that's involved in this conversation?
Yes, so the question, just to repeat it and correct me if I'm wrong, is there a difference in data that is voluntarily supplied to you versus data that you acquire? And the answer is no. Personal data is personal data is personal data. Now, there is a difference in the consent challenge, right? If an individual is taking the action of physically providing you with their personal information, that's very different than in my world, where we're relying on our publishers to have a consent management platform that's gathering consent for us to use cookies in our process, right? And so there are technical signals that we can operate off of. Those CMPs actually produce a string that drives the compliance logic within our tech stack. So it gives us some assurance, but it's not perfect, right? It requires the publisher, which is not in our control, to be doing very specific compliance things that put Sovereign at risk. So my challenge is shoring up that gap.
I want to add on to that with a little story. Sovereign has something called Innovation Week. And Innovation Week one time, I took a facial recognition model and I tied it to an ad. It didn't leave the browser. Nothing actually left the browser. Certainly never made it to production. But everyone was super creeped out about it because it would say, the entire ad was, hi, I see that you're a woman, and then it gave an age. Or, hi, you're a man, and it gave an age. Everyone said this was the creepiest technology ever. They thought it was really invasive to their privacy. All that went across was basic demographic information that is super common to get. And so I think it's almost more important to be careful with the data that you are given where they're using your application, because you're going to be using it in a way that those users don't expect to use it, and they're going to feel violated. It's not necessarily a privacy violation, but it's those types of actions that have put these questions into the forefront of everyone's mind. It's kind of like what I call, it's like this ick factor thing. So I think it's something to be really careful about and really cognizant about. You know, there is the legal portion of compliance, which we've really hit on a lot right now, but there's also that like user feeling portion of user privacy, and something that we really need to watch out for and respect.
I think the one thing that I'll just add to this conversation is that at Ping, for example, we think about consent in sort of two ways. So one is consent management. So that is like, how do you collect consent? How do you allow users to update that consent? How do you allow users to remove their consent? How do you delete that consent? So there's all these things around consent as an object, and then management of that consent. you have to separate that from consent, what we're calling like consent enforcement, which is I have this consent object. How do I now enforce that to all the different applications that potentially like will leverage this data, or but how do we like layer that on? Because I think like thinking about it that way helps to distinguish between, am I in the consent management phase of my application or my product, or am I in the consent enforcement portion of this, right? So anyway, just another perspective.
Hang on to it.
Sure.
Let's keep it rolling. Okay, so the last question I have, and then we can, in the next 4 minutes or so, we can open it up to more general Q&A. But my last question is, what do I do if I don't have enough legal or compliance privacy resources?
I would say, I mean, it's rough, right? Like, as Susan mentioned earlier, like, the rules and regulations don't change just because your size is smaller. But the one thing that I'll probably just advise is don't let it get to the point where you're found or where you're in trouble, and then that's the time that you seek out help. At Ping, for example, we have this general policy that like we will take all the the quote unquote silly questions internally, but do not let that get to the to the part where you're in front of the customer or potentially you're in front of the regulator, and then now you're having to like answer for all this stuff. So seek help early in the process, and don't let it get to the point where you're found or your customers find it for you or the regulators find it for you, is probably what I would say to that question.
All right. Well, very similar to what I said earlier, there's lots of examples online to help you figure out how to do this with limited resources. But what I would do is add to that saying, don't skimp on your own publicly available resources, because regulators are becoming more and more savvy to going and reading a privacy policy and then looking at the cookies that are dropped on them when they visit your site and what's happening with those cookies. And do you have a way to offer the ability to revoke your ability to process their personal information, and going back to those data rights requests and that sort of thing? So definitely, like Remy was just saying, don't be afraid to ask for help, and definitely shore up the things that are publicly open and findable.
So on top of just don't have the data, which is kind of my best advice, there's a lot of industry working groups that are there to help you with privacy. The IAB, for instance, has TCF and US privacy strings. They've got documentation, they've got source code, they've got everything you need to actually be able to comply with those regulations. There's the global opt-out, which several browsers do. So all this is like publicly available, documented, and those standards bodies can really help you get a leg up.
I saw a couple people writing that down. Did everybody catch that, or good? Oh, yeah. Will you repeat it, those resources that you just listed?
So there's the IAB, and they've got they have guidance on the TCF string, which is kind of one of the ways that you can comply with GDPR for website requests. That's what I was, GPP. And then that's being supplanted by the GPP, which is a global privacy project, which expands the reach of that type of string outside just the EU. So that can be useful.
I just want to emphasize what Melissa said. I think utilizing what's already out there, what your competitors are doing, what like Amazon and Salesforce are doing, you might not be able to emulate that, obviously, but just getting ideas, that's a great free place to do it. I think also launching like a privacy champion initiative at your company is another good way to spread privacy throughout the company, and it's really bridging the gap between a privacy function and the rest of the company. So you identify individuals from all business units that have access to personal data, and you teach them about privacy so that they can build those skills into their day-to-day jobs, and they can ask the questions, and they can consider privacy from the inception of an idea all the way through. And it's just like a way to kind of leverage privacy resources when you don't have an official privacy function.
Amazing. Thank you guys all for sharing such insightful responses to those questions. For the folks in the audience, what questions do you have?
Can I show something out there that you haven't talked about? Insurance. Because there's an insurance factor, because this is from mine, but insurance, security insurance comes down to your data. And this is a big overhead. I don't care where you're at, you have to start covering it too.
So the question was about insurance, and I think just like our thoughts on insurance, because it's a huge overhead and it's an important item for every company to consider. I think there's not enough insurance in the entire world to cover all the risk here and all of the security breaches here that are possible. I mean, it's just so expensive, and the premiums are so expensive for paying for the insurance that you're never going to have enough insurance. So you should not be relying on insurance. You need to get it. And if you can, I mean, there's a lot of increased scrutiny by insurance companies right now, whether they're going to give insurance to companies based on your security controls and the data you have in place. But if you are able to get it, it's really expensive. And so you just need to rely, I think, on other mechanisms. Like have it as a backstop, but don't be relying on it.
Thank you. I had to giggle just a little bit because Susan and I go back and forth on this so much, specifically because there's never enough insurance. And typically it's like the last thing you want to spend your cash on, right, is insurance. But you have to have some form of insurance. The other aspect of this too is that the insurance brokers and the insurance providers are getting more and more savvy in this space. So it's shifting more towards the insurance providers saying, well, you have to have X, Y, Z before we're even going to insure you. And once you get that insurance, it's not always guaranteed they're going to pay out, right? They will find ways to come back and say, well, you weren't strong enough in this area, so therefore it's your fault, and sorry, you violated this clause of your insurance policy. So it's a tough subject, and I personally would love to see like a deep dive into that, like panel style with brokers, insurance providers, and security professionals.
Is there anybody that hasn't? Please, yeah, go ahead.
The titles of this session, how do people use to advertise or like market to all the things that you're doing, like in the privacy space to your customers?
So like what about this makes it a competitive advantage and how to advertise that?
So we actually have in our sales materials what our compliance posture is. It's necessary. We have data products, and the first thing that people ask us is this legal? That's one way of putting it. And another way of putting it is like, is this compatible with our company's like the company that we're selling to's compliance posture? Is this something that's ethical? Is this something that's going to bite us in the butt later? Like, these are the questions that people really want to know for data-related services. And if you don't have that answer in the back of your pocket, you're going to have a hard time making data sales.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much I would wholeheartedly agree with that response as well. I also think, you know, it's interesting because like for example, for us, we started out as a software company, and we're transitioning into like a SaaS company, and the types of I think regulations and controls that we have to comply with as part, you know, when somebody makes a sale, you know, then they look at, okay, well, how are you handling all our data? And that's where lovely Susan here gets involved. But what I think is interesting is that the time now spent in us getting scrutinized for what our policies are and are we, you know, doing what the customers are asking us to do, it is extending the sales cycle a lot longer because they want to be rest assured before they sign that, you know, that purchase order, that, you know, that you're a business that they want to work with and that you have their best interest in mind. So just keep that in mind. It definitely extends the sales cycle, I think, more than we have predicted even for ourselves in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And one thing we're trying to do to help mitigate that is provide a lot of resources up front now. Like we recently launched a trust center on our website, which has like FAQs and like all sorts of resources. We also provide customers with like a transfer impact assessment summary. We're trying to implement that sooner in the sales cycle so that they can we can help them do their assessment. Like we're not gonna do it for them, but we can help them. What else do we have? We have we're about to have a CPRA FAQ, so we're trying to get like ahead of it and distinguish ourselves from our competitors in that way. I think being open and transparent builds trust, and that gives you a competitive advantage too. And I think just if you do experience a breach, being open and upfront about that and owning it is also going to build you more credibility in the market and be competitive.
I never said what I do, but I manage an enterprise sales team for Sneak, and even just something as simple as having a white paper or a single page FAQ that you send when you send a master subscription agreement over if you're selling to other businesses, it can go such a long way because it's drawing customers to information that they're going to double click on regardless, and it empowers you to own it early, and then also when you're doing good things, it allows you to advertise that early on with your customers.
Plus, on what you're saying is when you send it over, they send it to legal, so it helps them just kind of blunt legal off too.
100%, yeah. I mean, if you don't have FAQs in front of your MSA, it's a total win. So I don't know if Ping does that now, but we send FAQs with ours. So anyone else want to comment on that?
Just one other thing to consider that's not around advertising and differentiating your product itself, but depending on your business strategy, if you're shooting for M&A acquisition, right, and you want to make yourself more desirable, differentiate yourself that way, a little bit of compliance up front goes a really long way. Like, start to build out those processes of documenting where your data lives, establishing data retention policies to get rid of it as soon as it's not valuable, and creating compliance documentation like records of processing activities, those data transfer impact assessments, those sorts of things. If you do like some just-in-time compliance ops work from an M&A perspective, you're gonna look gorgeous to that buyer.
Such a great point. Anybody else that hasn't asked a question yet have a question?
Okay, so this might be a little bit new. I am new, so I'm starting the platform. So a lot of this has been towards advertising, which I have a cookieless advertising platform that I'm pretty happy with, called Reverse Ads. And but then I'm doing a lot. So I really want to be proactive because I'm at the start. And I realize that I have a lot of data that I have to do because I'm a marketplace that is all based around data on a buy and a sell side. And so, so I have to obviously protect the data, and I want to be in like global compliance. And so I realize that there's a big, ball of wax here that I have to figure out. And so, I realize about GDPR and ISO 27001, and and then there's a couple of different things, and so I'm just trying to figure out like what are the big pieces that I need to look out for so that I can say to the CTO make sure that we have these things at the start, and as we build everything out, there's also ISO 20022 that I also have to do because it's more that's the world that I'm in, which is a different thing, and so I have to get all these things to feed together, and I'm a little worried about it.
Seems easy.
I know, right? Do you want to speak to that at all? I got something. I feel like I've been hogging the microphone, so I'm really sorry. Just to repeat the question for everyone, basically his platform is more a data marketplace. So he's got data providers, he's got data buyers going on, very early in the process, trying to understand how to wrap his arms around compliance while meeting some different security standards. I wasn't familiar with a 202. Oh, gotcha. Okay, so, good gracious, sir. I think my advice to you would be to make sure you have strong counsel to help you craft your terms and conditions. And this might trigger something for you to tack on, Susan, but trying to transfer that risk over to your partners as best you can. And then beyond that, making sure that your own house is in order. So all of the ideas that we've laid out today are going to be as beneficial to you, because personal data is personal data is personal data, right? Unless you want to get into like the differential privacy space or obfuscation or any of that, that's more where your CTO can step in and kind of help you brainstorm what approach you want to take. But definitely splurge on some external help from a legal perspective.
Also, know where you're operating. Like, seriously, know where you're operating. Doing something in Belgium is very different from doing something in Oklahoma. And maybe take advantage of the fact that you can probably get away with it in Oklahoma.
I think those are all really great points. I do think, to Remy's point, like doing it right in the beginning. I know it's expensive. Lawyers are super expensive, which is annoying. But getting it right from the beginning when you're this complicated, I think is going to be really important in the long run.
All right, so we probably have time for one more question. Any last burning questions out there? Alrighty, in that case, thank you all so much for sharing with us. Thank you for asking good questions. And I'm guessing everyone will hang around for a few minutes, so if you want to ask for help one-on-one, free lawyer time available for 4 minutes. Thanks all.
Wait, I don't know if she volunteered for that.